People have written millions of words about Audrey Hepburn, documentaries, biographies, retrospectives, and yet two people who were there for the most formative chapter of her life have been left almost completely in the shadows. Her brothers, boys who grew up in the same broken home, who breathed the same occupied air during the Second World War, and who, when it was all over, said almost nothing about any of it. Their names were Alex and Ian, and most people who love Audrey Hepburn have never heard those names at all. Segment 10. A family that was never quite whole. To understand who Alex and Ian were, you have to understand where they came from. And that means starting with their mother. Ella van Heemstra was Dutch aristocracy. Born in 1900 into one of the Netherlands' most established noble families, she was the daughter of Baron Arnoud van Heemstra, a man who would serve as mayor of Arnhem and later as governor of Dutch Suriname. The Van Heemstras were the kind of family that had a place in history before any of their children were even born. Ella was 19 years old when she married Jonkheer Hendrik Gustaf Adolf Quals van Ufford, a former cavalry officer turned oil executive. It was 1920, and the couple set sail almost immediately for the Dutch East Indies, present-day Indonesia, where Hendrik was stationed for work with the oil industry. It was the kind of life that sounds romantic from a distance. Colonial estates, tropical heat, a world that moved according to its own rules. Their first son, Arnoud Robert Alexander, known always as Alex, was born on December 5th, 1920, in Batavia, the colonial city that is now Jakarta. Their second son, Ian Edgar Bruce, arrived on August 27, 1924, also in the Dutch East Indies. But the marriage was already fraying by then. Hendrik was away for months at a time, out on oil rigs, moving between postings. Ella was young, spirited, and increasingly restless. According to family accounts passed down through Ian's daughter Yvonne years later, Ella eventually left Hendrik for another man, a British financier named Joseph Ruston. She left. She left her husband, and according to what Yvonne later recalled from family stories, she initially left the boys too. Hendrik took his sons back to the Netherlands, settled near The Hague, found support from a Norwegian woman who helped look after the children. And then one day, without warning, Ella came back, slipping into the house through the servants' quarters while the boys were napping, and took them with her. Just like that, Alex and Ian were with their mother again, living under a different roof, with a different man, in a different world. Ella and Joseph Ruston married in Batavia in September 1926. They moved to Belgium, and on May 4th, 1929, in Brussels, a daughter was born. They named her Audrey Kathleen. Audrey was their half-sister, 9 years younger than Alex, 5 years younger than Ian. Segment 9. 3 children in a fractured home. The early years together, when there were early years together, held something genuinely warm about them. Photographs from the period show a little girl grinning beside 2 older boys who clearly adored her. Biographers who interviewed both Alex and Ian later in life found them remembering hikes through the countryside, afternoons playing charades, climbing trees despite their mother's explicit instructions not to. Ian, in particular, was remembered as the mischievous one, cheerfully recalling how disobedient they could all be when Ella wasn't looking. But the togetherness was always fragile, always interrupted. Audrey's father, Joseph Ruston, had a job that kept the family moving between Belgium, England, and the Netherlands. The family lived for stretches in Linkebeek, near Brussels, then back and forth through England, never fully settled. And when Audrey was 5 years old, Alex and Ian, then 14 and 11 respectively, were sent away to boarding school. After that, the siblings only saw each other occasionally. Boarding schools were common for children of their class and background, particularly for boys, and it wasn't unusual for parents of that era to view long separations as simply part of how a proper upbringing worked. But for Audrey, who was already shy and prone to retreating inward, the loss of her brother's company was real. Biographies of Hepburn note that she became close to her mother by necessity during this period. Ella became her primary world, which was both a source of warmth and, in many ways, a complicating dynamic that would follow Audrey into adulthood. For Alex and Ian, boarding school meant another kind of displacement. They had already been uprooted from the Dutch East Indies, already been taken from their father, already been brought into a household built around a man who was not their father, and now they were separated even from that. They were becoming young men in institutions, not in homes. Whatever continuity a family might provide was available to them only in pieces. School holidays, occasional visits, the odd summer together. Then things got worse. In 1935, Joseph Ruston left. He walked out of Audrey's life. The couple's divorce was not finalized until 1939, but the departure itself was immediate and complete. Audrey would describe it years later as the single most painful event of her childhood. She called it being dumped. She said children need two parents, and that his departure stayed with her for the rest of her life. Ella moved Audrey to the Van Heemstra family estate in Arnhem. Alex and Ian, by that point, were spending much of their time near The Hague with their father Hendrik's side of the family. The three siblings were, once again, living separate lives. Then Ella sent Audrey to England. In 1937, the young girl, known at her small school in Eltham, Kent, simply as Little Audrey, was being educated in a world that felt entirely removed from the one her brothers were living in back in the Netherlands. And then, in September 1939, everything changed for all of them. Because the war that nobody wanted to believe was coming had arrived, and it was going to reach directly into this fractured family and reshape the lives of everyone in it. What Alex and Ian chose to do in the first months of the occupation would put both of them on a path that almost no one outside the family knew anything about. Segment 8. The War Arrives. When Britain declared war on Germany in September 1939, Ella made the decision to bring Audrey home. She was convinced, as many Dutch people were, that the Netherlands would remain neutral, as it had during the First World War. She had Audrey flown back from England. The Van Heemstra family gathered together in Arnhem for the first time in years. Alex was 19. Ian was 15. Audrey was 10. For a brief moment, the family was reunited, living under the same roof, navigating the same uncertain world. There were evenings at home, the familiar rhythms of siblings figuring out how to share space again after years apart. The Van Heemstra name still carried weight in Arnhem. Their grandfather had once been the city's mayor. But the calm didn't last long. On May 10th, 1940, Germany invaded the Netherlands. Within 5 days, the Dutch military had surrendered. The occupation had begun. What followed was 5 years that none of them would ever fully leave behind. The Germans moved quickly to assert control over daily life. A curfew was imposed. Jewish residents were systematically stripped of their rights, their businesses, their freedom. Dutch men were required to register with the occupation authorities. Young men, in particular, were increasingly at risk of being conscripted into German labor programs, rounded up, and sent to work in factories across the Reich. The streets of Arnhem filled with German soldiers. Shop windows changed. Posters went up. The language of public life shifted. For a family that had moved across countries and languages and political upheavals for decades, there was still something different about this. something that had a quality of permanence, of slow suffocation. For the Van Heemstra family, the occupation was not an abstraction. It was immediate, personal, and inescapable. Ella had spent part of the late 1930s sympathetic to certain fascist ideas. She and Joseph Ruston had even collected donations for the British Union of Fascists before their separation, and she had met Adolf Hitler and written favourably about him for British fascist publications. But the realities of German occupation stripped away whatever political sympathy she had held. What replaced it was something harder and more urgent: resistance, and her sons were already ahead of her. Segment 7. Alex, the one who disappeared. Of the two brothers, Alex was the older one. Born in 1920, he was already a young man when the war began. And when the Germans arrived and started demanding compliance from Dutch citizens, demanding registration, demanding loyalty, demanding participation in Nazi youth programs, Alex refused. The Germans had established something called the Netherlands Institute of Folkish Education, a program near Arnhem designed to draw young Dutch men who fit the Aryan ideal into a process of political indoctrination and physical conditioning, with the goal of eventually recruiting them into the Nazi movement. Both Alex and Ian refused to join. That refusal alone was an act of defiance in an occupied country. Alex went further. In 1941, Alex went missing. His family had no word from him. Nothing. In an era before mobile phones, before instant communication of any kind, silence like that meant only one thing to the people who loved you. They assumed he was dead. He wasn't. What had actually happened was that Alex had joined Dutch forces still attempting to resist the German occupation. When those forces were eventually overwhelmed and forced to surrender, Alex was captured as a prisoner. But he managed to escape. And rather than attempt to return home, which would have meant walking directly into danger, he went underground. He spent the remaining years of the war in hiding, moving between safe locations, staying out of German hands. For years, his family did not know this. His mother, his brother, his little half-sister Audrey, they all lived with the open wound of not knowing whether he was alive or dead. 3 weeks after the liberation of the Netherlands in April 1945, Alex appeared. He came home to Arnhem with a pregnant wife. Their child was born that July, Audrey's first nephew. Life, somehow, had continued even through the years of silence and fear. But Alex's story doesn't end with the war's end. It ends in 1979 when he died, still a relatively young man at 58. He had kept quiet about most of what happened to him during the war. Like so many survivors of that period, he carried it privately, and what remained after him were fragments: a few genealogical records, a handful of family stories, and a footnote in his more famous half-sister's biography. What happened during those years in hiding, the exact circumstances, the people who helped him, the close calls, was largely never told. And while Alex carried his silence to the grave, his younger brother Ian had a completely different war. One that took him in the opposite direction entirely, not underground and hidden, but directly into the hands of the enemy. Segment 6. Ian, the resistance fighter who walked home. Ian's story is different from Alex's, though no less extraordinary. Where Alex disappeared, Ian stayed visible, at least for a while. And where Alex kept his war experience almost entirely to himself, Ian let just enough slip through, years later, to give us a partial picture of what he endured. Ian was 15 when the Germans invaded. By the time he was old enough to act, he had already decided what side he was on. He joined the Dutch resistance. By accounts gathered from people who knew him and from documents compiled later, Ian was described as a fearless participant. He distributed underground flyers, the kind of work that, if discovered, could mean immediate arrest. He worked with Radio Oranje, the clandestine broadcast operation that kept Dutch citizens connected to the outside world and to the Free Dutch government operating from London. He helped organise student protests. He encouraged Dutch railroad workers to go on strike, which was an act of direct defiance against the German occupation's logistics. The Germans relied heavily on the Dutch rail network to move personnel, supplies, and, devastatingly, Jewish prisoners to transit camps and deportation points. Disrupting those railways was not a symbolic act. It had real consequences. Ian knew exactly what he was doing. He knew the risks. He did it anyway. His activities eventually drew the attention of the German authorities. He was arrested. Ian was deported to Berlin and put to work as a forced labourer in a munitions factory. He was a teenager in an industrial facility, producing weapons for the army that had invaded and occupied his home country, surrounded by exhaustion and deprivation, with no way to contact his family. His mother and his sister had no word from him. For the duration of his time in Berlin, they did not know whether he was dead or alive. The conditions in forced labour facilities in wartime Germany were severe. Workers were given minimal food, subjected to long hours, and housed in cramped, inadequate accommodations. Disease was common. The physical and psychological toll was enormous. Ian was a young man from a Dutch aristocratic family, thrown into an industrial setting in a foreign city under one of history's most oppressive regimes. Whatever he encountered there, and he would share almost none of it, left marks that lasted for the rest of his life. He survived. He survived the factory. He survived the final months of the war, during which Berlin became the center of the most devastating fighting in the entire European conflict, as Soviet forces closed in from the east and the city was reduced to rubble. The Battle of Berlin in April and early May 1945 killed hundreds of thousands of soldiers on both sides and left the city physically destroyed. For anyone inside it, including the forced labourers who had no ability to leave, those final weeks were a kind of sustained terror. When the Soviets liberated the area where Ian had been held, he was finally free. And then he walked home, 300 miles, or by some accounts closer to 325 miles, on foot from Berlin to Velp, a suburb of Arnhem where the family had been living since the worst of the fighting had forced them to relocate. The roads passed through bombed and shelled territory. Bridges were gone. Towns were rubble. Displaced people moved in every direction. Ian was one figure among millions in that vast post-war exodus, with nothing but the direction he was walking and the uncertainty of not knowing whether his family was still alive at the other end. When Ian reached Villa Boykenhof, the house in Velp where the family had sheltered, he knew he was home before he even knocked on the door. His daughter Yvonne, speaking with biographer Robert Matson decades later, recalled the story Ian had told her, that he looked up at the window of Audrey's bedroom and saw her makeup box sitting on the sill. And in that moment, he knew the family was still there. Audrey's makeup box. That's what the end of the war looked like for Ian Qualls van Ufford. Not a proclamation, not a ceremony. A small box in a window. After the war, Ian worked for a cargo shipping company running routes between the Netherlands and Indonesia, the very region where he and Alex had been born. He eventually built a business career there. He married a woman named Yvonne Scholtens in November 1951, and they had 3 children. A daughter they named Audrey Yvonne, after his half-sister, along with Sandra Clare and Andrew Ian. Ian lived until 2010. He died at 85 years old, outliving Audrey by 17 years. But to understand what Ian came home to, and what Audrey had been living through while he was gone, you have to understand what the occupation had done to the rest of the family in the years that Alex and Ian were away. Segment 5. What the war did to the family around them. To understand what Alex and Ian went through, you also have to understand the larger world that surrounded them during those years. Because the Van Heemstra family, as a whole, was hit by the war in ways that went beyond Alex's disappearance and Ian's deportation. In August 1942, German occupation forces carried out a reprisal execution. 5 Dutch civilians were shot in response to a sabotage attack by the resistance. An attack that the victims themselves had nothing to do with. Among those killed was Otto von Limburg-Stierum, the husband of Ella's older sister, Miesje. He was Audrey's uncle by marriage. He and the 4 other men executed alongside him were buried where they fell, in a remote forest near Goorle, close to the Belgian border, a location so deliberately isolated that the Germans hoped it would never become a place of remembrance. The execution of Otto van Limburg-Stierum was the moment that permanently ended whatever remained of Ella's earlier sympathy for right-wing politics. She had flirted with fascist ideas in the 1930s. Now her brother-in-law had been shot dead by the regime she had once given the benefit of the doubt. Any ambiguity in her position was gone. After that, Ella, Miesje, and Audrey left Arnhem and moved in with Ella's father, Baron Arnoud van Heemstra, in the nearby town of Velp. It was a household in which grief and anxiety had become permanent fixtures. Alex was gone, believed possibly dead. Ian was somewhere in Berlin, under conditions no one wanted to fully imagine. A beloved family member had been killed, and meanwhile, the daily reality of occupation continued. Curfews, food shortages, the constant awareness that one wrong word or wrong step could have catastrophic consequences. Audrey, by then a teenager, was navigating all of this while also trying to continue her ballet training and quietly assisting the local resistance. She adopted a Dutch-sounding pseudonym, Edda van Heemstra, because her given name, Audrey, was conspicuously English-sounding in an occupied country where being associated with Britain carried real danger. She performed ballet recitals, sometimes with German officers in attendance, who had no idea that the graceful young dancer on stage had spent the morning delivering messages for resistance operatives. She worked as a courier for a local resistance doctor named Hendrik Visser 't Hooft, who used children as messengers precisely because the Germans tended not to scrutinize them as closely as adults. By the winter of 1944, the situation in the Netherlands had become catastrophic. The Battle of Arnhem in September of that year, the military operation later known as a bridge too far, turned the region into a combat zone. Afterward, the Germans imposed brutal restrictions on food distribution in the occupied Dutch territories. What followed became known as the Hunger Winter. The Hunger Winter. An estimated 20,000 to 22,000 Dutch civilians died of starvation and cold between late 1944 and the liberation in spring 1945. Audrey was among the millions who went hungry. She developed severe malnutrition, which led to anemia, respiratory problems, and edema, swelling caused by the body retaining fluid as a response to starvation. The physical effects of those months followed her for the rest of her life, contributing to the fragile quality of her health and, by some accounts, influencing her naturally slender frame in ways that were not the result of any deliberate effort. She later recalled eating tulip bulbs. She recalled watching trainloads of Jewish families being transported from the local station, a memory she described with a precision and weight that never faded. She described seeing a boy at the platform, pale, blonde, wearing a coat much too large for him, stepping onto a train. Those memories didn't leave her. They became part of who she was. Segment 4. Liberation and the Long Road Back. April 1945. The Allies were moving through the Netherlands. On April 16th, the Canadian forces reached Velp. The occupation, at least in this corner of the country, was over. Audrey remembered the liberation with a vividness that matched her memories of the worst of the war. She asked the British soldiers for chocolate. They gave her 5 bars. She ate all of them immediately and became violently ill, her malnourished body overwhelmed by the sudden richness of it. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, the predecessor to UNICEF, began distributing food and supplies through local schools. Audrey picked out sweaters and skirts that had been shipped from the United States. 3 weeks after the liberation, Alex came home. He arrived in Arnhem with his pregnant wife, and within a couple of months, Audrey was an aunt. Shortly after, Ian appeared at the front door of Villa Boykenhof. Having walked the roughly 325 miles from Berlin, he was home. For a moment, the family was together again. The same family that had been scattered and battered for years. The mother who had lost her brother-in-law to a reprisal firing squad. The older son who had spent years underground after being captured as a prisoner. The younger son who had survived forced labor in a Berlin munitions factory and walked home across a shattered continent, and the teenage girl who had danced for German officers and carried secret messages and gone hungry through the worst winter anyone in the Netherlands could remember. They were all alive. That alone was something that could not be taken for granted. Segment 3. After the war and the silence that followed. Audrey left the Netherlands in 1948, moving to Amsterdam and then to London to pursue her career. She studied ballet, discovered her limitations as a dancer due to the physical damage of the war years, and pivoted toward acting. By 1953, she was a Hollywood star. By 1954, she had won both an Academy Award and a Tony Award in the same calendar year. A feat almost no one had ever achieved. The girl from Arnhem had become one of the most famous women in the world. It's worth pausing on what that transition actually looked like, because it happened fast, almost disorienting fast. In 1948, Audrey was a malnourished teenager in a war-damaged country with a talent for ballet she couldn't fully pursue due to the physical toll of the hunger winter. By 1953, she was on the cover of American magazines. The world that had tried to starve her had, within less than a decade, made her its most beloved face. She rarely talked about the contradiction. She carried the war the same way her brothers did, close and quiet, not offered up for public consumption. But unlike Alex and Ian, Audrey eventually found a way to channel what she had lived through into something outward. Her humanitarian work was not incidental to her fame. It was, in some deep way, the reason the fame ultimately mattered to her. She used the access her celebrity gave her to go to places that the world preferred not to look at directly. She sat on the ground with children in Somalia, in Ethiopia, in Bangladesh, in Guatemala. She held babies. She testified before the United States Congress about the conditions she had witnessed. She did this until she was physically unable to continue, and she died less than a year after her last major UNICEF mission. Alex and Ian remained in the background. This was not Audrey's choice. She maintained real affection for both brothers, and Ian in particular stayed a presence in her life. He attended her funeral in January 1993, when she died of colon cancer at the age of 63, at her home in Tolochenaz, Switzerland. In a photograph taken at Bergenstock in 1964, Ian can be seen standing alongside Audrey, Mel Ferrer, Monsieur, and Ian's daughter Yvonne. A quiet family gathering in a mountain resort, looking for all the world like any other family on holiday. But the war was never far from the surface, even if it rarely came up directly. Ian, in the years after, became someone who did not talk about what had happened to him in Berlin. His daughter Yvonne recalled that he shared only two stories from his time in the forced labor camps, one about falsifying documents to give himself a different identity, and one about hiding a miniature radio inside a matchbox, small enough to conceal from the guards. And even those two stories, she said, would leave him unable to sleep for nights afterward. Whatever else had happened to him there, the full weight of those months in a munitions factory in a city under siege, he kept locked away. He didn't talk about hunger, didn't talk about the other workers, didn't talk about what he witnessed as Berlin was bombed and shelled into ruins around him. He came home, he built a life, and he let the silence grow over everything else, like grass over old ground. Alex, for his part, was even more private. He died in 1979 at 58 years old. What little is known about his wartime years comes mostly from the broader record: that he refused Nazi conscription, that he fought with Dutch forces, that he was captured and escaped, that he spent the rest of the war in hiding. The details, the daily texture of those years underground, were not left behind in any form that has survived. There's something very particular about that kind of silence. It wasn't unusual among people who lived through the Second World War. An entire generation made the same calculation, that the things they had witnessed and survived were not things that could be adequately put into words, and that trying would do more harm than good. They carried what they carried, and they got on with the business of living. But the silence also meant that what Alex and Ian went through was largely absorbed into the larger story of their more famous half-sister. Their names appear in biographies of Audrey Hepburn as supporting characters: the brothers who were in the resistance, the brother who was sent to Berlin, the brother who came home. They are mentioned and then passed over. The full weight of their separate experiences, the arc of two lives lived in the shadow of one of history's most violent periods, doesn't get the same extended treatment. Segment 2. What was lost and what remained. There's a version of this story that treats Alex and Ian primarily as context, as background material that helps explain how Audrey Hepburn became the person she became. And it's not wrong exactly. The war years did shape her in ways that were permanent and profound. Her lifelong commitment to UNICEF, her visceral understanding of hunger and displacement, and what it means to be a child in a world that has stopped protecting children. None of that came from nowhere. It came from the specific years she lived through in Arnhem and Velp, and the family she lived through them with. But Alex and Ian weren't context. They were people. Alex was born in 1920 in the colonial Dutch East Indies, grew up across two continents, lost his family to divorce and distance, refused to bow to an occupying power when he was barely out of his teens, fought for his country, was captured, escaped, spent years underground, not knowing if he would ever see the people he loved again, came home, had children, built a life, and died at 58. He became a husband, a father, a grandfather. He had mornings and arguments and ordinary days. That's a complete human life. The fact that his half-sister became Audrey Hepburn doesn't diminish it. It shouldn't reduce him to a footnote. Ian was born in 1924, also in the Dutch East Indies, grew up in the same fractured household, became a teenage resistance fighter in an occupied country, distributed underground literature, helped coordinate opposition to the German regime, was arrested, was deported to a forced labor facility in Berlin, survived the closing battle of the European War, walked 300 miles home, saw his sister's makeup box in the window, and knew he was finally back, rebuilt his life, married, had 3 children, including a daughter he named after his half-sister, and lived until 2010. Ian's daughter, Yvonne Waller, speaking to biographer Robert Matson years after her father's death, was the one who filled in many of these details. She was the keeper of what little remained. The family stories passed down at Christmas dinners, the photograph albums, the two fragments Ian had been willing to share about falsified papers and a hidden radio. The rest of what he carried, he took with him. Ella van Heemstra, the woman at the centre of both families, the baroness who left her first husband, reclaimed her sons, fell in love with a man who turned out to have fascist sympathies, lost a brother-in-law to an execution, and watched her 3 children scatter across a continent at war, outlived all of them for a time. She died in 1984. She had been, by all accounts, a complicated woman, imperious and warm, politically confused, and then transformed by personal loss, ambitious for her daughter in ways that were both supportive and suffocating. She lived long enough to see Audrey become everything she had hoped for, and long enough to see Alex die at 58, and to watch Ian carry his silence into old age. Whatever regrets she had about the early years, about the desertion, about the political misjudgments, about the children separated and scattered, she took with her as well. Segment 1. The Last Thread. When Audrey died on January 20th, 1993, the funeral was held 4 days later at the small village church in Tolochenaz, Switzerland, where she had made her home. It was a gathering of the remarkable and the intimate, her sons Luca and Sean, her partner Robert Wolders, ex-husbands Mel Ferrer and Andrea Dotti, Hubert de Givenchy, actors Alain Delon and Roger Moore, UNICEF executives, representatives of the Dutch royal family, and Ian. Ian was there. He was 68 years old. He had watched his little half-sister grow up from the girl who climbed trees in spite of their mother's protests, through the terrible years of the war, through the Hollywood stardom, through the decades of humanitarian work that had taken her all over the world. He had danced at the edge of her life, close enough to be present, far enough to stay out of the light. He outlived her by 17 years. He died in 2010 at the age of 85. Alex had died in 1979, 31 years before Ian and 14 years before Audrey. He left behind a son, Michael Allen van Ufford, and whatever pieces of his life could be assembled from the genealogical records and the biographical footnotes. What both of them left behind, in the end, was something harder to catalogue than dates and names. They left behind the particular shape of a survival that doesn't get recorded, the kind that happens quietly, in an ordinary house in a Dutch suburb, in a Berlin munitions factory, in years of hiding, in the act of walking home across a broken continent, because there was nowhere else to go. There's a tendency, when we talk about the Second World War, to organize the stories around the people whose lives were documented and publicized. The ones who wrote memoirs, gave interviews, became public figures. The people at the center of the frame. But most of what happened during those years happened to people like Alex and Ian, people who survived, who came home, who rebuilt what they could, and who eventually grew old and died without most of the world knowing their names. The silence they kept wasn't emptiness. It was weight. It was the weight of things witnessed and endured that couldn't be reduced to a story told at a dinner table without doing damage to something essential. Ian's daughter understood this. She preserved what she could. She shared what she was given permission to share. And Audrey understood it too. She spent the rest of her life trying to respond to what her family had lived through, not in words, but in action. In the years she gave to UNICEF, in the places she went, in the children she sat with in Somalia and Bangladesh and Ethiopia and Guatemala, she was doing something that no interview could fully explain. She was trying to put her body in the places where suffering was happening, because she knew what it felt like to be inside that kind of world, and she had survived it, and her brothers had survived it, and she understood, with a directness that only experience can produce, that survival is not the end of the story. It's just the part where you figure out what to do next. Alex and Ian Qualls van Ufford were born in the Dutch East Indies at the beginning of the 20th century, raised across multiple countries by a mother who was by turns reckless and devoted, separated from their half-sister by age and circumstance, and a war that rearranged everything. They fought for their country when they were barely adults. They survived things that many people did not. They came home. For most of the decades since, they've lived as names in parentheses, mentioned in the margins of a story that belongs, in the public imagination, entirely to someone else. But the margins of history are where most of the living actually happens. The people who don't give interviews, who don't appear on magazine covers, who put their wartime years in a drawer and close it. They were there. They made choices. They paid prices. They loved people and were loved back. Alex lived from 1920 to 1979. Ian lived from 1924 to 2010. They were Audrey Hepburn's brothers, and they deserved more than a footnote. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories. There is a photograph taken at London's Heathrow Airport in April 1963. Olivia de Havilland, two-time Oscar winner, Hollywood legend, stands on the tarmac holding her teenage son's hand. It is a completely ordinary travel photograph. Nothing in it suggests what is already quietly unfolding inside that boy's body, or what it would eventually cost both of them. She died in 2020 at the age of 104, widely regarded as the last surviving major star of Hollywood's golden age. 2 Academy Awards, a landmark legal victory that changed entertainment law forever, a century of living, and behind all of it, 2 children whose stories most people never heard. A son who fought the long aftermath of a disease diagnosed in his teenage years. A daughter who chose privacy so completely that most of the world barely knew she existed. Both of them shaped, in ways visible and invisible, by the woman at the center of it all. Before we get into either of those, we need to go back to the beginning. Segment 10. The woman behind the legend. To understand Olivia de Havilland's children, you have to first understand who their mother was. Not the version on the screen, but the version that existed between the films and after the cameras stopped rolling. She was born on July 1st, 1916, in Tokyo, Japan, to a British father and an English mother. Her father, Walter de Havilland, was a patent attorney who had come to Japan for work. Her mother, Lillian, was a trained stage actress with a formidable personality and strong opinions about how her daughters should be raised. When Olivia was just 3 years old, her parents separated, and her mother eventually moved both Olivia and her younger sister Joan, later known to the world as Joan Fontaine, to California. Her father stayed behind in Japan and largely removed himself from their lives. The 2 girls were raised almost entirely by their mother. The 2 sisters grew up in Saratoga, a small town in the Santa Clara Valley, about 50 miles south of San Francisco. It was a quiet, relatively ordinary upbringing for 2 girls who would both go on to win Academy Awards. Olivia was the elder by about 15 months, and from childhood, the dynamic between the 2 sisters carried a competitive edge that never fully went away. By her teenage years, Olivia had already begun acting in local theatre, displaying a natural talent and a seriousness about the craft that set her apart. When Austrian director Max Reinhardt came to California in 1934 to stage a production of A Midsummer Night's Dream at the Hollywood Bowl, an 18-year-old Olivia was offered a role as an understudy. When both the lead and the first understudy dropped out just before opening night, she stepped in and played Hermia. Reinhardt was so impressed that he brought her along for the Warner Brothers film version in 1935. That was how it began. Through the late 1930s and into the 1940s, she became one of Warner Brothers' most prominent leading ladies, often appearing alongside Errol Flynn in adventure films like Captain Blood and The Adventures of Robin Hood. The two had an undeniable chemistry on screen, and their pairing was enormously popular with audiences. But Olivia was always after something more substantial, and the studio kept assigning her the same type of role: the soft-hearted love interest, the gentle companion, the woman who waited while the man had all the adventure. She found it limiting and said so. Her frustration eventually led to a legal battle that would define her legacy almost as much as her actual films. In 1943, she took Warner Brothers to court, arguing that the studio had unlawfully extended her contract by adding suspension periods onto the original 7-year term. It was a genuinely courageous move. Other major stars, including Bette Davis, had tried and failed to challenge the studio system in similar ways. Olivia succeeded. The ruling that came from her case, still known today as the de Havilland Law, fundamentally limited how studios could bind actors to long-term contracts. It changed the balance of power in Hollywood in ways that benefited performers for generations afterward. Her dramatic work in the years that followed earned her 5 Academy Award nominations and 2 wins, for To Each His Own in 1946 and The Heiress in 1949. By then, she was widely regarded as one of the finest actresses of her generation, not just a studio contract player, but a genuine artist with something to say. But by the time that second Oscar arrived, her personal life had already taken a direction that would shape everything that followed. And that direction began with a man named Marcus Goodrich. Segment 9. The First Marriage, Marcus Goodrich. In the summer of 1946, while appearing in a stage production at the Westport Country Playhouse in Connecticut, Olivia de Havilland was reintroduced to a man she had briefly met before: Marcus Aurelius Goodrich. Goodrich was 18 years her senior, born in 1897 in San Antonio, Texas. He was a U.S. Navy veteran, a journalist, and the author of a critically admired 1941 novel called Delilah, set aboard a Navy destroyer. The book had earned serious literary praise, which gave Goodrich a certain standing in intellectual circles, and he wore that standing with obvious pride. He was intense, well-read, and opinionated in a way that some found magnetic and others found exhausting. He had, in fact, already been married 4 times before he met Olivia, to 4 different women across 2 decades, which said something about how he operated in close quarters. When her sister Joan Fontaine heard about the relationship, she was not subtle in her skepticism, remarking that all she knew about the man was that he had had 4 wives and written 1 book, and that it was a pity it wasn't the other way around. That comment deepened the already troubled rift between the 2 sisters in ways that would take years to even partially heal. Olivia, for her part, moved forward. She and Goodrich were married on August 26, 1946, the same day she opened in her Connecticut stage production. The speed of the marriage, only 3 weeks after they reconnected, was notable. Whatever drew her to him, it drew her quickly. For a few years, the marriage seemed to function on the surface. She continued making films, including some of the most acclaimed work of her career: The Snake Pit in 1948, The Heiress in 1949. He continued writing, or attempting to. But the household had an atmosphere shaped largely by Goodrich's temperament, which those around them described as unpredictable and domineering. He was not an easy man to live with, and the tension in the home increased steadily over the years. His controlling behavior extended not just toward his wife, but toward their son as well, something that was noted by those close to the family. It is worth pausing on that detail, that the controlling atmosphere in the Goodrich household touched Benjamin too. He was a small child during the worst of it. Children absorb what is around them, even when adults believe they are shielding them. Whatever Benjamin took from those early years, he carried it with him as he grew. When Olivia filed for divorce in 1952, the language in her legal suit was striking. She stated that Goodrich had pursued a course of cruel treatment and had inflicted grievous physical and mental suffering upon her, without provocation or excuse. The divorce became final the following year. Their son, Benjamin Briggs Goodrich, had been born on September 27, 1949. The same year, Olivia won her second Oscar for The Heiress. He came into the world in Los Angeles to parents whose marriage was already under serious strain. He was 3 years old when the split became official, and just as that first chapter closed, a second one was about to open. In Paris, of all places, thanks to a persistent stranger with a camera and a press pass. Segment 8. The Second Marriage. Pierre Galante. In 1953, Olivia was newly divorced and making her way through the world as a single mother with a young son. She brought Benjamin to the Cannes Film Festival that year, and it was there, on the French Riviera, that she first noticed a man watching her. Not in an intrusive way, more like someone trying to work up the courage to say something. His name was Pierre Galante. He was the executive editor of Paris Match, France's most widely read illustrated news magazine, and by most accounts, a man of considerable charm. He had been assigned to cover Cannes and found himself drawn to de Havilland in a way that apparently made concentration on the actual film festival rather difficult. He was 10 years older than Olivia, and unlike Marcus Goodrich, his reputation among those who knew him was that of a warm and genuinely sociable person, someone who moved easily through the world and made the people around him comfortable. Galante pursued her openly and persistently after that encounter, and eventually she agreed to see him. The courtship worked. On April 2, 1955, they married, and Olivia de Havilland relocated to Paris, a city that would remain her home for the rest of her long life. She settled into a home near the Bois de Boulogne, the large park on the western edge of the city, and began building a life there that was genuinely separate from Hollywood. She would make films occasionally in the years ahead, but Paris was now the center of gravity. Their daughter, Giselle Galante, was born on July 18, 1956. She was born into a more stable household than Benjamin had been, at least in the early years. Olivia was 40 years old at the time of Giselle's birth, an age that, in the 1950s, was considered quite late to be having a child. Benjamin was 6 years old when his half-sister arrived, old enough to be aware of the new shape of the family, but young enough to adapt to it. For a time, the family lived a genuinely Parisian life. Olivia had left the intensity of the Hollywood studio system behind and had settled into an existence that revolved around her children, her marriage, and selective film work. Paris gave her something California never had: a degree of privacy and an identity that wasn't entirely constructed around her status as a film star. She was a resident of the city, a mother, a wife. She took that seriously. But the marriage to Pierre Galante did not ultimately hold either. The couple separated in 1962, though they chose, for the sake of Giselle, to wait until 1979 to finalize the divorce. It was an unusual arrangement, born of an obvious concern for their daughter's stability. Giselle was 6 when her parents separated, and 23 when the divorce was finally made official. Whatever the strains between Olivia and Pierre, they had decided early on that Giselle did not need to carry the weight of a broken home while she was still a child. Even after they separated, they remained close enough that when Galante was diagnosed with lung cancer in his later years, Olivia was the one who looked after him. He died in 1998, having spent his final years with his ex-wife nearby, a testament to something durable that had survived the end of the marriage. So by the time Giselle was grown, she had experienced something fairly unusual: parents who no longer lived as husband and wife, but who clearly still cared about each other's well-being. That shaped her in particular ways. But it was Olivia's son, Benjamin, who carried a heavier story, and it had already begun years before anyone in the family fully understood its weight. Segment 7. Benjamin. The diagnosis. Benjamin Goodrich grew up with his mother in Paris after her move there in the mid-1950s. He attended school in France, was raised in the Episcopal Church, his father's faith at his mother's intention, and by all accounts was an intelligent, quietly driven young man. The photographs from his childhood and early teenage years show a boy who looks comfortable in his own skin, often at his mother's side in airports and at public events, seemingly unfazed by her fame. He grew up speaking French and English, moving between cultures with the ease that comes from being genuinely formed by both. He was close with Olivia. That much was evident, not just from photographs, but from the way she would speak about him throughout her life, with a steadiness that only comes from a relationship built on genuine affection and daily presence. What happened next began at age 19, when Benjamin received a diagnosis that no one in the family had seen coming: Hodgkin's lymphoma. Hodgkin's disease, as it was more commonly called at the time, is a cancer of the lymphatic system. In the late 1960s, when Benjamin was diagnosed, medical understanding of the disease had advanced considerably compared to earlier decades. Treatments existed, and survival rates were improving. But the treatment protocols of that era, while effective at attacking the cancer, came with consequences that doctors were only beginning to fully understand. The therapies used to fight Hodgkin's could, over time, place enormous stress on the heart and other organs. For some patients, the damage accumulated quietly over years, even decades, long after the cancer itself had been brought under control. Benjamin fought back against the diagnosis. He didn't retreat from his ambitions. After his treatment, he returned to academics and eventually earned a degree, and later a master's, from the University of Texas, an institution he had a particular connection to given his father's deep Texas roots. His great-great-grandfather, also named Benjamin Briggs Goodrich, had been among the signatories of the Texas Declaration of Independence in 1836, a piece of American history that gave the family name a certain gravity. After graduating, Benjamin went to work as a statistical analyst for the Lockheed Missiles and Space Company in Sunnyvale, California. It was serious, technical work, numbers and trajectories, and aerospace logistics. A world away from his mother's Hollywood legacy, but one he had clearly built on his own terms. He later worked in international banking as a representative for the Texas Commerce Bank in Houston. By any measure, he was living a full and purposeful life, carrying the weight of his diagnosis privately, while the world around him had no idea what the treatments of his teenage years had quietly set in motion inside his body. None of this looked, from the outside, like the life of someone still living under the shadow of a teenage cancer diagnosis. He was building a real career. He was moving through the world. But the heart was carrying what the treatments had left behind. Segment 6. Benjamin. The long consequence. The particular cruelty of what eventually caught up with Benjamin Goodrich was not the cancer itself. He had survived that. It was the damage that the treatments had done to his cardiovascular system over the 20-plus years since his diagnosis at 19. By the late 1980s, after years of working in aerospace and banking, Benjamin had made a decision that said a great deal about his character. He returned to the University of Texas to pursue a doctorate. He was in his late 30s at this point, working towards something longer and more demanding, perhaps because the closer he got to his own limits, the more he wanted to leave something behind. The decision to return to academia after a full career in the private sector is not an easy one. It requires a willingness to start again, to be a student when you have already been a professional. Benjamin made that choice deliberately. He had moved back to Paris, to his mother's home, in fact, in the period leading up to his death. That fact alone speaks to how the relationship between mother and son had developed over the decades. Not every adult child could move back in with a parent as celebrated and private as Olivia de Havilland. Not every mother would have it that way. But that was where he was, in the apartment on the quiet street near the Bois de Boulogne, in the city where he had grown up. There is something circular and, in its own way, peaceful about that. A life that ended in the place where it had been shaped. He died on September 29th, 1991, 2 days after his 42nd birthday, at his mother's Paris home. Heart disease, brought on by the long-term damage caused by his Hodgkin's treatments. He had carried that ticking consequence inside him for more than 2 decades before it finally gave out. He was 42 years old. His funeral was held at the American Cathedral in Paris, the same church where his mother had served as a scripture reader for years, and where she herself would eventually be mourned nearly 3 decades later. What followed almost immediately after made the loss even harder to absorb. His father, Marcus Goodrich, died just 3 weeks later, on October 20th, 1991. He was 93 years old, the man who had caused his mother so much pain, the same man she had described after his death as a masterful writer and a remarkable person, died barely 3 weeks after his only son. Father and son, gone within the same month. Olivia was 75 years old when all of this happened. She had, in 1 month, lost both her first child and her first husband. She would live for nearly 30 more years after that. There is something deeply unusual about outliving your child by 3 decades. About continuing to live in the same Paris apartment where your son spent his final months. About going on to receive honours, give interviews, and attend events, all while carrying that particular weight. She never spoke extensively in public about Benjamin's death. She was not a person who weaponized grief for attention. But those who knew her understood that his absence had changed the texture of her later years in ways that no award or honour could touch. And her daughter, watching all of this, had already quietly chosen a very different path through the world. Segment 5. Giselle, the quiet life. If Benjamin's story is defined by a diagnosis and its long shadow, Giselle Gallant's story is defined mostly by deliberate absence, her near-total withdrawal from the public world her mother inhabited. Born in Paris on July 18th, 1956, Giselle grew up in the city that had become her mother's home. She was the daughter of Pierre Galante, the French journalist, and she inherited something of his professional sensibility. She did not go into acting. She did not pursue a career that placed her in front of cameras or audiences. Instead, she studied law at the Université de Droit de Nanterre School of Law in Paris, a rigorous academic training, and then transitioned into journalism, working as a reporter for both French and American outlets. It was, in a meaningful sense, a career that combined both parents, her father's professional world and her mother's ability to move between French and American cultures. She built it quietly, without fanfare. Giselle married twice. Her first marriage was to Edward Roy Broider. That union ended in April 2006 with his death, after less than a year of marriage. Her second marriage was to Andrew Chulak on September 18, 2011. She has no children, which means that when Olivia de Havilland died in July 2020 at the age of 104, she left behind no grandchildren. The line, after all of that history, simply stops there. What is known about Giselle's relationship with her mother speaks to a genuine closeness that deepened as both women aged. When Olivia was appointed Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire in June 2017, at the age of 101, and received her honour from the British ambassador to France at her Paris apartment in March 2018, Giselle was at her side. At the time of her mother's death in 2020, it was Giselle who handled the estate and the many details that come with the passing of someone who had been famous for over 80 years. She has spoken with genuine warmth about her mother, noting in one interview that Olivia had tremendous respect for her fans and answered nearly every letter she received, and that Giselle herself had often helped her do so. After Olivia's death, Giselle oversaw the auction of her mother's personal effects and Hollywood mementos, including items that had belonged to Bette Davis, one of Olivia's closest lifelong friends, and artifacts from collaborations that stretched all the way back to the 1930s. Giselle specifically requested that a portion of the proceeds from her mother's estate be donated to the American Cathedral in Paris, a place that had been deeply meaningful to Olivia for decades. That detail, donating to the cathedral, says something. Olivia had been one of the first women to read scripture publicly at that cathedral back in the 1970s. She had been on the regular rotation for readings on major religious occasions well into her 90s. The cathedral was where, in 1991, Benjamin's funeral services had been held. It was a building that held both grief and devotion in the same walls. Giselle understood that. She carried it forward. Segment 4. The household they grew up in. There is a question that doesn't get asked often enough when people discuss Olivia de Havilland's later life, and it is this. What was it actually like to grow up as her child? Benjamin and Giselle had a mother who was one of the most recognizable women in the world for the first several decades of their lives. Someone who received standing ovations at the Academy Awards in 2003, her final appearance there, simply by walking onto the stage. Someone who was still reading scripture at a cathedral in Paris into her 90s, and who, at 101, became the oldest woman ever to receive a Dame Commander title from the British Crown. That is an enormous presence to grow up alongside. And yet the evidence suggests that both children navigated it in reasonably healthy ways. Benjamin by building a technical career in aerospace and academia, Giselle by stepping into journalism and maintaining a private family life. Neither of them seemed to be running away from something. They just made choices. But Olivia had also, as a mother, made deliberate choices about how she raised them. She had deliberately raised Benjamin in the Episcopal Church and Giselle in the Roman Catholic faith, each child in the religion of their respective father. That level of intentionality, of thinking carefully about what each child specifically needed, suggests a mother who was paying attention even when the world was also demanding enormous amounts of her attention. It is worth noting, too, that both children grew up in Paris rather than in Hollywood. That was not an accident. After her move there in the mid-1950s, Olivia built her life at a deliberate distance from the machinery of the American film industry. Her children went to school in France. They grew up bilingual. They understood French culture from the inside, not as outsiders looking in. Benjamin carried that in the way he moved through the world. The Texas family roots, the Parisian childhood, the American university years. A genuinely international sensibility built from a genuinely international life. Giselle perhaps even more so. She studied French law, worked as a journalist in both France and the United States, and occupied a space between two cultures so naturally that it seemed less like an identity she had constructed and more like simply who she was. Both children had inherited something real from the unusual geography of their upbringing. The household also had the particular texture of one shaped by a parent who had been through a great deal before her children arrived. Olivia was 33 when Benjamin was born, and 40 when Giselle came along. She was not a young mother starting out with everything still open in front of her. She was a woman who had already fought a landmark legal battle, won 2 Oscars, lived through the collapse of a difficult marriage, and relocated herself to a foreign country. She knew things. That knowledge had to have shaped the atmosphere in that Paris apartment, even when it was never put into words. She had also remained close to both her ex-husbands in ways that must have mattered to the children. She said kind things about Marcus Goodrich publicly after his death. She cared for Pierre Galante through his final illness after cancer took hold, despite having been legally separated from him for decades. The children were watching a woman who, despite 2 marriages that ultimately didn't hold, chose not to let bitterness define the relationships. That is not nothing. It is, in fact, quite rare. Segment 3. A mother who outlived her son. There is no tidy way to account for the arithmetic of Olivia de Havilland's life. She was born in 1916. Her son was born in 1949. He died in 1991. She lived until 2020. She spent 29 years as a mother who had outlived her child. In the years after Benjamin's death, she continued to give occasional interviews, to appear at select public events, and to maintain the composed, dignified presence that had always defined her public persona. She was not a woman who dramatized her private sorrows for an audience. In the rare instances when she addressed Benjamin's death, she did so with restraint. What she said about his father, the man who had caused her documented suffering during their marriage, was that she had deep regard for him as a person and considered him a masterful writer. That statement, made after both Goodrich and Benjamin were gone, was its own kind of closure. She had found a way to hold the complicated truth of that first marriage without letting anger be the last word. But there is a particular kind of endurance required of a parent who buries a child and then goes on living for 3 more decades. The world expects you to absorb it, to carry it without letting it show too obviously, and then to continue being whoever the world needs you to be. Olivia de Havilland did exactly that. She continued being Olivia de Havilland, the actress, the icon, the dame, the woman who had once taken Hollywood's most powerful studio to court and won. None of that erased what September 1991 had taken from her. The fact that her son died in her own home, that she had been there, nearby, in the weeks and months leading up to it, gives the loss a particular kind of intimacy that is easy to gloss over when you read it in a brief biography. He had come back to Paris. He had been working on his doctorate, reaching toward something. She had been his mother until the very last moment. Whatever conversations passed between them in those final months, they happened in a Paris apartment on a quiet street near the Bois de Boulogne, out of sight of the cameras and the awards ceremonies and the retrospectives. And then his father died 3 weeks later, and whatever complicated feelings she had about Marcus Goodrich, the difficult first husband, the source of documented suffering during their marriage, the man she later described as a remarkable person, those had to be processed at the same time, in the same grief-saturated weeks. She was 75 years old. She handled it the way she had handled everything else in her life, by continuing to exist, and to do so with as much grace as she could manage. Segment 2. The final years and what was left behind. Olivia de Havilland spent her last years in the same Paris apartment she had lived in for decades. The city had been her home for longer than most people had known her as a film star. It was the place where she had raised both her children, where she had cared for Pierre Galante at the end of his life, where Benjamin had come back to in his final months, and where, on July 26th, 2020, she died quietly in her sleep. She was 104 years old. In her final decade, she had largely withdrawn from public life, but remained mentally sharp and engaged with the world around her. She had continued reading, continued corresponding with people who mattered to her, and continued attending services at the American Cathedral, which had been a constant presence in her Parisian life since the 1970s. She had been one of the first women to serve as a reader there, reading scripture aloud to the congregation, and the practice had stayed with her across decades. There was something fitting about that. A woman who had spent her professional life giving voice to other people's words had, in her private life, found deep meaning in giving voice to words that carried a different kind of weight entirely. Her funeral was held at the American Cathedral in Paris, the same building where her son's services had been held 29 years earlier. She was cremated, and her ashes were placed in the crematorium at Père-Lachaise, the famous Parisian cemetery that holds so many of history's most significant figures. Plans were made for her ashes to eventually be transferred to a family burial place on the British island of Guernsey, a nod to the English family roots her father had carried with him when he first moved to Japan, decades before she was born. Giselle survived her. She was in her 60s when her mother died, and she stepped into the work of settling the estate and preserving the legacy with the careful attention of someone who had spent a lifetime watching how her mother lived. In one of her most telling comments in the period after Olivia's death, she noted that her mother had answered nearly every fan letter she ever received, and that she, Giselle, had sat beside her helping with the responses. That image, a 90-something Olivia de Havilland at a table in her Paris apartment, working through letters from strangers with her daughter helping alongside her, is somehow more revealing than any of the awards or legal battles or famous film roles. It is an image of a woman who, to the very end, took her relationships seriously, with her fans, with her faith, with her family. She had won 2 Oscars. She had changed entertainment law. She had been appointed a Dame of the British Empire at 101. She had appeared in Gone with the Wind and watched the world change around her for a century. And she had also sat in a Paris apartment in 1991, in the week after her son's death, and had to find a way to keep getting up in the morning. Both of those things are true. The second one is not less important than the first. Segment 1. Looking back. When you lay out the full picture of what happened to Olivia de Havilland's 2 children, certain things stand out. Benjamin Briggs Goodrich was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma at 19 and spent the next 2 decades building a genuinely accomplished life. Academic, professional, multilingual, international, before the long-term damage from his treatment caught up with him at 42. He died on his birthday. He died in his mother's home. His father followed him out of the world 3 weeks later. 2 generations gone in a single month. He never married, as far as the record shows, and left behind no children of his own. The Goodrich line that had run from the Texas Declaration of Independence through a Navy novelist to a statistical analyst working on his doctorate in Paris simply ended there, quietly, in a Paris apartment. Giselle Galante-Chulac is still alive. She is in her late 60s. She built a career in journalism, married twice, and has no children. She is the last person on earth who knew Olivia de Havilland as a mother rather than as an icon. That is an unusual position to occupy, to be the sole remaining keeper of the private version of a very famous life. She has carried it with evident care and without any apparent interest in the spotlight her mother occupied so naturally for so many decades. What both children had in common was a mother who was extraordinarily present in the way she chose to remain close to them, regardless of what else was happening in her professional life or in the aftermath of her marriages. She moved to Paris and stayed there. She raised her children in the city where she had chosen to build her real life. She did not farm out the emotional labor of parenting to someone else while she pursued her career. When her son came back to Paris in his final months, she was there. When her daughter needed her mother by her side for a ceremony at 101, she was there. That does not make her a saint, and the children of famous parents carry burdens that are hard to fully quantify. But it does mean something that both Benjamin and Giselle grew into people who seemed, by all available evidence, to genuinely like and respect their mother, not merely love her out of obligation, but actually want to be around her and to carry what she stood for into whatever came after she was gone. In the end, the story of Olivia de Havilland's children is not a story of dramatic scandal or tabloid spectacle. It is something quieter and more lasting than that. It is the story of a woman who survived an enormous amount, professionally, personally, medically, and who, through all of it, kept showing up for the people who mattered most to her. She outlived most of them. That is its own kind of weight. But she showed up, every time, for as long as she could. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.